1907, Cowessess First Nation surrendered a large portion of the original reserve. Citizens and leaders since that time have asserted that that was wrong. Cowessess has made several attempts to resolve this wrongful surrender since 1907. The 1907 land claim is a specific claim that was submitted to Canada on behalf of Cowessess. Last spring in 2019, leadership from Cowessess First Nations traveled to Ottawa to advocate for the acceptance of this 1907 land claim. On January 17th, Canada has accepted responsibility for the wrongful surrender of 1907 lands from Cowessess First Nations. I look forward to achieving fair settlement on behalf of Cowessess for the 1907 land surrender. I look forward to negotiations, but I want to acknowledge all the leaders and citizens of the past that have carried this 1907 claim forward. Congratulations, Cowessess First Nations.
The history of Cowessess First Nation and the land set aside for Cowessess First Nation is very rich, but it also has a little bit of controversy in regards to the role the Government of Canada played right after we settled. After the Agreement of Treaty 4, Chief Cowessess and our ancestors settled here officially in around 1881. In 1889, we were given order in council from the Government of Canada for Indian Reserve number 73. From 1885 to around 1915, our ancestors excelled in agriculture. We were winning competitions with the best grain, with the best cattle. It's shown that Cowessess First Nation was able to transition from a nomadic lifestyle to a First Nation reserve that is grain, that is cattle. The local settlers around us started to watch, and they started to want some of our land. At that time, the Government of Canada breached its fiduciary obligation and trust to Cowessess First Nation. The decision makers of that day started to settle with the settlers' demands rather than Cowessess First Nation. In 1906, the Government of Canada sent negotiators to Cowessess to surrender lands south of Cowessess today. That vote did not pass. Again, a couple months later, they sent negotiators to settle again. Again, our ancestors voted no. On the coldest day known to record in January 1907, they came a third time. And this time the vote was 14 no, 15 yes. At that time, they created a name on the vote called Nap Delorme. An individual walked in and voted. Nap Delorme was not on any of our records as a Cowessess First Nation citizen or band member. It then had on record that Alex Gaddy showed up, one of our ancestors, and voted in favor, which officially gave the Government of Canada the approval to surrender. 2 weeks after the vote, Alex Gaddy was on record stating that asking for his $700 for voting in favor. Alexander Gaddy never got his $700 for voting in favor. This is what you call a breach of duty from the Government of Canada. Today, the Liberal government, the Government of Canada, has the obligation to address First Nations with outstanding land claims. This land claim started in the 1970s. Our late Mushums and Kokums, our mums and dads, worked diligently and a lot of time was spent on this. Our great lawyers Al Brabant and Dan Madigan have been working on this file since the 1990s. In 2017, the Council agreed to relaunch the 1907. In 2018, we submitted a claim and it met minimum standards. Cowessess First Nation is ready to negotiate with the Government of Canada so that we can settle this claim and move forward. The Trudeau government, the Liberal government, the Government of Canada inherited this. We inherited this. If we can settle the 1907, it'll help us today and our children yet unborn to invest in our economics, to invest in our First Nation. It also puts a really warm feeling in all of our hearts that all the hard work that our Kokums and Mushums and mums and dads did years prior, it paid off. The ones that passed on may never benefit from what happened to them when the land was removed. But as their ancestors, we can benefit today. Of Cowessess First Nation and the 1907 land surrender. In around 1905 to 1911, Frank Oliver, who was a decision maker for the Government of Canada, held dual cabinet positions for both the Minister of Interior and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. Mr. Oliver was quoted back as far as 1880 as being a staunch advocate of settlers' interests over those of First Nations. In 1906, a record exchange in the House of Commons in Ottawa took place between Mr. Lake, a Member of Parliament around the Cowessess First Nation, and Mr. Oliver as follows. I brought to the attention of the Minister last year the case of an application which was being made for an opening of portion of the Crooked Lake Indian Reserves. The people in that section are most anxious that a portion of any rate of that reserve should be placed on the market. It's quotes like these that are on record that showcase that Cowessess First Nation did not have the advocacy and did not have the duty of care that the Crown promised us at treaty. In the House of Commons, Minister Oliver at the time expressed these sentiments. But of course the interest of the people must come first, and if it becomes a question between the Indians of Cowessess and the whites, the interest of the whites will have to be provided for. Therefore, under the leadership of Frank Oliver, the Department of Indian Affairs developed a plan to secure a surrender for the most southerly 6 miles of Cowessess First Nation next to the CPR rail line. In 1907, during the coldest winter in living memory and with no hint of a demand of surrender from the Cowessess First Nation itself, William Graham, under the direction of Frank Oliver, presented the Cowessess First Nation with terms of the surrender prepared by Canada without prior request or consultation with the First Nation. The Indian agent recorded the vote as 15 for surrender and 14 against. Among those recorded as voting for surrender was Nap Delorme, which is not a name of any known member of the band at that time. The available record also indicated that among those who voted for the surrender there was a contradictory understanding of the terms. Cowessess First Nation contests the legality of the surrender on grounds that there was no band consent as required under the Indian Act, and that in any event Canada breached its fiduciary duty of loyalty. The land that was taken in the 1907 surrender represented 100% of the reserve land within 6 miles of the CPR main line. 94% of the reserve were hay acres. 81% of the reserve shortfall grass acres was provided pasture for the First Nations cattle herds, and 72% of the reserve's open arable acres, which at the time were the most economical for the crop production. A specific claim was submitted under the Specific Tribunal Act in September of 2017. This is not the first time that this was submitted to Government of Canada. This goes back to the 70s. In 2017, we got as a First Nation from the Minister on February the 7th that the claim met minimum standards. This claim was previously reviewed with non-binding recommendations for negotiation was made by Indian Claims Commission in March of 2001. The 1907 land surrender is 113 years old. We look forward to working with the Government of Canada to settle this, to go to negotiations, and find means to invest in our nation so that the next 100 years, the 1907 land surrender, where our ancestors suffered, the great-grandchildren and children yet unborn will benefit to make sure that this never happens again and that we can be the strongest First Nation that they always wanted us to be.